Ladies, gentlemen, and bodies of water, welcome to the Alchemy Lab. Welcome back to something entirely new. We have met in a tavern, and we've met a guest today. This is something slightly different. All right, with me is Mr. Lee.
Hello, everyone.
All right, and with us today is RadioRetroFuture. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so let's. I'll let you tell everyone who you are and what you do.
All right. I'm known as Bonsart Bocal. I have a YouTube channel called RadioRetroFuture, which is dedicated to steampunk and its related subjects, genres, and communities. I am also a published writer. Last year, I published my first novel, The Wrench in the Machine, which is the first book in my series, The Association of Ishtar, and its companion comic, S36, The Call Girl, which is a comic book adaptation of my first story I ever wrote for that series, and also kind of a pilot to another spin-off series that I want to write, which is more militaristic. It's a small sample of what I've done. I've also made an audio drama for Fallout 4 in collaboration with Old World Radio Boston. That was kind of like my whole introduction into audio dramas and sound editing, in collaboration with a couple dozen steampunk inspired bands. Of course, I also have the Steampunk Beginner's Guide. That's what most people know me of, a documentary series on steampunk. I've done a lot of other stuff as well. I also do cosplay, as people would call it. I have a theme group. We do kids activities on events, just to name a few things.
Nice, very good. And I'm insanely jealous of your chair.
Thank you.
I want this. I want a chair like this. It's like the architect's chair in the Matrix.
Oh, I think it's an original Chesterfield. I got it at some very strange Curiosa store near the German border that had offered it somewhere. So I went with the car to this very small store. I think it was closing down at the time. And so it's my second chair I used for the show. The other one we now use for events. So that's now on a cart somewhere in the basement.
All right. Well, okay. So you have a stunt chair and a show chair.
Kind of, yeah. I would like to turn it into a kind of cyberpunk, steampunk throne, but or logistical means are too limited to transport to something like that safely. So, unfortunately, yeah.
All right. Brilliant. Okay. Well, so you mentioned steampunk a few times there, and steampunk is a really interesting sort of subgenre of a bunch of things, because I think people have a lot of ideas about it and a lot of preconceptions about it that are kind of all over the place, and maybe people kind of talk about it and have no idea what it is. So, basic question first of all, what is steampunk?
So my definition of steampunk, actually, I have three definitions for steampunk. For one, it's, of course, an aesthetic, which is very much inspired by history and pop culture. Then it's the literary genre that I write, for instance. And then it's also refers to a community, which is mostly a costume culture, but also has created its own set of traditions that kind of like spread worldwide into various local communities. So that's also where the misunderstanding comes from, because people talk about steampunk as it's one abstract thing, but actually it's a word that has several meanings. So whenever I discuss this, whenever I write a blog, I always reiterate, like, this is my definition for steampunk, this is what I'm talking about, and this is the topics we need to separate. Especially the aesthetics and the literary thing we need to separate when discussing it.
Okay. All right. So the literary side of it, I think, is probably the thing that we would focus on the most, because I'm a writer. You are a writer as well, and Lee, you're in a creative space alongside us, really. So the literary side of it, what kind of conventions and things make that up?
Well, I mean, for me, I talk in the terms of steampunk always as a kind of alternate history with all these pop culture tropes. Recently also kind of like had this discussion with somebody with one of the topics when, for example, when I talk about steampunk in fantasy, first of all, I want to reiterate that steampunk does not have like a monopoly on its aesthetic or themes. And that's also one thing people always talk about, like all these various punks, like, oh, when it's a Zeppelin, it's steampunk, and when it's a car, it's diesel punk, which I think is completely arbitrary. Those are aesthetics, most of all. So there's one thing where it often goes wrong in conversations. And when it comes to like the literary, for me, when steampunk is the strongest, comes out strongest, it's also kind of limited in some regards, is when it talks about progress and the themes of cyberpunk. Really, I often like to summarize the literary genre as cyberpunk in the past, which is also the kind of like that Bruce was it Bruce? No, not Bruce Sterling. Or was it Bruce Sterling? No, the guy who wrote Neuromancer, Gibson. I think that he described it as cyberpunk in the past. And that's kind of like where the whole steampunk literary genre came from. It was basically a bunch of cyberpunk writers. They started writing all these like stories inspired by H.G. Wells and 19th century authors like Jules Verne. Kind of started combining that and added that with their own favorite things that comprise cyberpunk. So, and that's where the term steampunk comes from. It was kind of like an in-joke. I think it was Sterling who came up with the name in Locus magazine. We have this combination, this collection of stories, because that's what the genre is. It's an existing collection of stories. And now people are trying to do it the other way around. They try to invent a genre before they've even written their story, So it was an existing collection, and in the Difference Engine by Bruce Sterling, and I think William Gibson was the co-author of that, they kind of like refined this idea of cyberpunk in the past. Thus, they created this world where the Difference Engine had become a reality. It's an analog computer. International Steampunk Day is also on the day that the Difference Engine was presented in the Royal Society as an idea. It never came true, but in the Difference Engine they kind of like focus on this technological aspect. Well, what if it was true? What would happen? So you get this world where everyone's information is already like in a hard copy form somewhere, and they have like these massive machines that print out everyone's information and store everyone's information. So also the singularity, that also then happens in like, what is it, 2010 or something. I forgot the year, but just like cyberpunk that didn't age that well. But for me, when it comes to cyberpunk as a literary genre, I really focus on the alternate history and how technology in particular would change the world. And this is also one of the heavy themes, especially in the Association of Ishtar, how they've got access to all these parallel worlds, all these alternate histories, as it were. And, some of them are futuristic. So they start like taking the ideas from those futuristic worlds, start applying it to their own 19th century. So, and what does that do? And also when it comes to the Association of Ishtar's primary world, they don't have inventors because they take all their ideas from other worlds. So
okay, so like the explorer is the inventor in a way.
That's a great way of putting it.
Okay, it's an interesting sort of it's an interesting thing to focus on, like how the technology affects the world. It's an interesting focus point for storytelling.
To kind of like emphasize why I'm so interested in that topic is like when I made my series steampunk, like I was looking for what makes steampunk unique, what makes it separate from your typical sci-fi and and fantasy in particular, because a lot of people like, are you familiar with the term Clark tech?
No.
Nope.
So Clark tech is a word inspired by Arthur C. Clarke, well-known science fiction writer from the Grungebeckian era of sci-fi. And he had like these 3 laws about science fiction. And I think this is his second law from the top of my head, that says, well, that advanced technology, so advanced, it's indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah.
And people kind of like took this idea and strawmanned the argument and said, oh, well, if technology is indistinguishable from magic, we might as well just include magic. That kind of led to the creation of one of my, most beloved characters up to this point, which is Igraine. S06 is her number in the story. Who is a kind of a girl who grew up in an Artico cyberpunk world, being taught that their technology is actual magic.
Right.
Okay, so it's sort of a in some ways similar to certain kind of hard sci-fi. It's more a lot. It sort of goes away from the idea of kind of the mystical and the sort of otherworldly in terms of like I guess maybe even divinity. I mean, it steps away from that and more into the kind of innovation of things have an explanation, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, it's always going to be a never-ending discussion. Like, is steampunk, is it fantasy? Is it sci-fi? I mean, there are some people who say, well, obviously it's fantasy, and then they basically point to the aesthetics of it. And I don't care much about the typical aesthetic of steampunk all that much. I care about the storytelling aspects, the storytelling potential that steampunk has and what we can explore. And I'm also a history buff, so for me, sci-fi and history, steampunk, it's perfect for me. And because I get to talk and explore 2 things I love, and so that's very important to me. And I also think this is important because I also started out as a reenactor. That's kind of like my gateway into fantasy or sci-fi. And I cared a lot about the practicality of my medieval costumes and armor, and I've done that for nearly 14 years. Did pretty much everything possible in that scene, and I cared a lot about those correct aspects and understand how the clothing worked. And because when you look at a medieval costume, they've got these weird socks instead of trousers, things like that. But once you wear it and start working in it, then you start to understand, like, oh wait, this is actually very useful clothing. Of course, we don't have that lifestyle anymore, so to us it has no value. It's the same reason why we don't wear hats or long trench coats or, well, look presentable in general. So I really look at it from that perspective, and I treat my fantastical characters like Denker Lexicon in a very similar way.
On the presentable point, I want to reiterate to everyone, I do have more than one shirt. I realize I'm wearing the same shirt. I do have more than one, I promise.
I'll take your word for it.
So it sounds like it has a lot of parallels to, it seems like it has a lot of parallels to fantasy and sci-fi without being exactly one or the other. So I guess it kind of leads into the question, well, 2 questions really. So what makes good steampunk, and what is the appeal? What's the appeal of it to you?
What's the appeal and what's the appeal to me is 2 different questions. I do want to talk about like what's the general appeal, because even though like when people say they don't like steampunk, they really talk about the costuming of the people going to conventions. The Gaussian brown, like, but they don't talk about you know, what people, the aesthetics used in, for example, video games. Like one of my favorite aesthetics in video games is probably Frostpunk. I really enjoy that game. I like what it tries to do, but I also love the aesthetics where they have these fantastical things, yet they have designed it in a way it looks plausible. It works. Whether it could actually work, that's a whole different thing. When it comes for especially when it comes to aesthetic, I love steampunk when it gives you that credibility that yeah, I see how that can work. You know, and one of the wonderful things, because it's often inspired by 19th century technology, because 19th century technology has like these moving parts. And the fun thing about seeing moving parts, we can understand how it works. We understand the idea behind the sprockets and the pistons and the gears, you know, and well, okay, how does this work?
Right, yeah.
You know, you move on the touchscreen, something happens, and you know, everything is invisible now. So it's basically magic, I guess. Well, steampunk isn't. You can actually analyze, see it, and have that objective look on it, I guess.
Well, the technology is very like big and very brash and very loud as well, and it's got that look. It's got like
and
the brass look
relatable
to it.
and relatable.
Yeah.
And you know, this is, I mean, yeah, we use it, but you know, if you would open it and show you, well, this is what the inside of a mobile phone looks like, you know, it's not like you're gonna take a selfie with that, you know. Because it all looks alike. You don't understand it. You know, you can imagine yourself getting a Lego set of a steam train and assemble that somehow. Well, and I think that relatability, you know, that ability to analyze and see what's actually happening, and of course, moving parts. Men like moving parts in general. So and also for the women in that regard, I mean, they love the dresses, you know, they love the Victorian elaborate clothing, you know, and the feminine aspect, which is well, also kind of like nowadays being pushed to the wayside. So I think that's also the idea that, you know, men dress well, the women dress well. I think that's also a major appeal. Now, what appeals to me, I already kind of like said it. I love the literary aspect most of it all, which is this combination of, you know, sci-fi. I was really into Ghost in the Shell when that came out, and much of sci-fi. I don't like fantasy in general. It's all very same-ish to me, you know. The reason why I don't care much about Mortal Engines. People talk about like, oh, it's the best thing ever, and I'm like, I watched it with Vendor for other podcast, and you know, I started summarizing the series or the plot of the movie, and that's like, this is a sci-fi, this is a fantasy film.
Is Mortal Engines the one where the cities are all moving?
Yeah, that's the one with the cities. Yes.
Right. Okay.
And I was, well, kind of disappointed, because you have this hook like, oh, moving cities, awesome. But then you actually read the book, and then it's basically a fantasy story where, well, the moving cities are a setting and not much else. It's a metaphor. That's the problem with a lot of the low fantasy stuff. It's a metaphor for our society, you know, because they use gas basically, and you know, there's only a limited amount of gas, so it's doomed space. That's the whole thing. And when you actually want to delve into that, when you actually want to like go into how it works, you know, it's like, well, there is nothing there, because it's all metaphor for you know, what the author really cared about, and you cannot build upon metaphors essentially. So that's Lee, I'm gonna let you jump in, because you haven't said anything yet.
I've been like, I'm just really enjoying this at the moment. I've been trying to wrap my head around. So I know a little bit about steampunk. As far as I was aware, it was sort of like that electricity basically was never invented. That's how I sort of got it. And as you've been speaking, I still don't know where to put it in between sci-fi and fantasy. And I find that very interesting. What question do I want to ask though?
Well, I can comment on that on the place while you formulate your question, which is and this is one thing, and this is something that a lot of steampunks don't realize either. Unfortunately, there's way too little conversation. I can explain why that is, but you know, the thing with steampunk, what makes steampunk so interesting is that a lot of people like they put a lot of emphasis on Jules Verne and stuff like that. Like, you know, what was a steampunk? Well, have you seen Wild Wild West? You know, like, oh, you haven't seen Wild Wild West. No, I don't know how to explain steampunk then. But here's the thing, like, why this emphasis on Wells and Verne? Because there's another thing that steampunks put a lot of emphasis on, and that's superheroes. They have a lot of steampunk superheroes. You know, if there is a popular franchise, within a few months, there's going to be steampunk versions of that. I'm sure you will be able to Google steampunk Squid Games by now and get a number. And here's the thing, steampunks love pop culture. They know jack shit about history. That's hilarious. If you ask them who Bismarck is, you know, well, because there's now a video clip by Sabaton about the battleship Bismarck, they'll probably say that. They don't know there's an actual guy called the Iron Chancellor who was one of the biggest chats of his era, who basically is responsible for all the bullshit that's going on in the world today, single-handedly. You know, it's hard to. They have no clue who that is. Well, when you do anything about European politics at the time, you cannot get around him because you know how the people talk about the Illuminati. Well, he's a one-man Illuminati, you know. And he did it in public too. So there you go. And so that's the thing. The steampunks know very little about history. They know their history when it's relevant to pop culture, and that's why I put a lot of emphasis in my series on steampunk's relationship to pop culture, because that's what they care about. They love the old pulps, the old writers of science fiction. That's what they care about. You know, ask them anything about that. And that's where they draw their inspiration from. And when it comes to writers, it's that, but also local history. That's kind of interesting. Steampunk authors love to write about local histories, their own family histories, stuff like that. That's what I noticed. I also do a podcast where I talk to a lot of authors. So you're welcome, by the way, if you want to join that. So
be glad to.
And so that's where steampunk differs from, let's say, your typical sci-fi and your typical fantasy. I like, one of the reasons why I don't like fantasy, it's so enamored with its own tropes. You know, it's well, as one of the people who gave feedback on Tolkien said, not more fucking elves. That's actual feedback that Tolkien got when he presented this idea to his writing buddies. But you know, I mean, of course, there are people. I guess I like Game of Thrones. I used to like the series Game of Thrones because it kind of like went away from the magic.
Don't get us started on Game of Thrones.
I mean, but you know, I wouldn't be able to read the books. Just too many names and characters. I prefer my stories, you know, about one guy, you know, being confronted with his own environment, his own technological, theocratical stuff, you know, dealing with that and either being driven insane or having to overcome it. You know, that's what I love about high concept. It's situational stuff. But yeah, I think I spoke enough for now.
Well, what you said there about fantasy is really interesting, and I think it appeals to. I think that applies to sci-fi a little bit now as well. That it's very much, it's focused on its own tropes, and it's also always a lot now. Mostly now, it's very focused on being an allegory for today. And as someone who writes fantasy and writes sci-fi, trying to get away from that is really, really hard, and trying to make something that's truly in its own world, and trying not to think about today so much is a tricky thing to do. I find I think it's easier for me to do with sci-fi than it is with fantasy.
Well, I mean, fantasy is a low concept genre, so you're automatically putting characters in storylines with a lot of metaphors that are, that relate to them personally. And, what a lot of people do, especially in low concept stories, is like, what if I am this character? What kind of adventures would I want to do? So if you are really into like current day politics, that's the kind of characters you're likely going to write. So there's a there it can be a real mask off moment. And I think when it comes to high concepts, the character is not necessarily the focus. It's the idea that's the focus. And especially when I wrote The Wrench in the Machine, I just started writing. I had already written a bunch of short stories for the Association of Ishtar, because the Association of Ishtar is mostly its short stories at the moment. I have not published them in an anthology yet. It's something I want to do. I also hope to find more writers. Speaking of which, is also one of the reasons why I'm now doing the writing challenge, 2,000 words, for the people who are interested in that type of thing. However, so the Wrench in the Machine is basically all those short stories put together. I've got it over here. I guess I have the obligatory shield. This is my first comic, S36.
Fantastic.
Yes, really proud of it. And this amazing cover of The Wrench in the Machine by Star Ranger. Who knows, maybe in the future I will have another thing with him. I'm currently also working on a coloring book with amazing art for those interested in that type of thing. And that's kind of like how I bring the world to life. But the Wrench in the Machine, this big boy, is one of the reasons it's so thick. It includes 6 short stories, because the short stories with the Association of Ishtar are like file entries. And each of them like have their own topic, their own character that is being investigated by the Association of Ishtar. And one of the reasons I choose for that format is to like kind of get away from the typical tropes of steampunk, to show people, because I have my documentary series, I get a lot of questions about writing stories and characters and things like that. And my idea is really, okay, well, this is also a way to do steampunk. One of the first characters I create is the Call Girl, who is a kind of multi-dimensional assassin. That story is the foundation for the whole of the multiverse. And and then also how, for example, the associates all have numbers instead of code names. So you've got associate 6 and associate 12 and associate 321 is in the book. And the reason was because the Call Girl, she got her name from number stations. Are you familiar with that phenomena? Yeah, so you've got, like, for those back home, secret services, I think they still use them. They broadcast these random numbers into the ether, which are relevant to agents in the field. We don't know what the numbers mean because we don't have the code book or whatever it is they use to decode those numbers. And the Call Girl recites those numbers before she attacks. And that's kind of like where the idea that the associative numbers come from, that they are actually related to them personally.
Right.
So that's where that idea comes from. And she has like all these numbers tattooed on her face, which she then notches out, like the notches on a gun. So and soon I'll have a miniature of her too, a bookend and a miniature. So
fantastic.
Those interests. And and that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of things I want to develop with the Association of Ishtar. And I kind of like created this collection of items and subjects and things that the association encounters, and kind of combined them into a grander story into the novel. So yeah, and those ideas together. The character in the book is an inspector. I wrote it for people who are new to the series as a whole. So the guy had to be a fish out of water, and he's just an inspector doing what inspectors do. And he gets this strange murder case that he's working on. And it turns out that the Call Girl was responsible So he all of a sudden gets attacked by a cyborg. And one thing, I wrote a few blogs on this too, for people who want to know more about the philosophy, is that the world of the Association of Ishtar looks at the surface like typical 19th century. There are, technologically speaking, they're somewhere near the 1920s. So they have electric cars, they have radios and entertainment, because, you know, the Cold War contacts people through radio, so there needed to be radios. And I also wanted to do audio logs for my audiobooks that I also have on my YouTube channel, RadioRetroFuture. So if you don't have time to read the short stories, they're also there, animated, on our channel. And yeah, so that's kind of like how I go around this. Like, you know, you create all these problems. I have this thing I want to explore that leads to a number of things that need to be included. I build it up. Okay, how did those technologies came up there? I created this company called Utter Crap, which is in the Netherlands, which is well, one of the companies most responsible for bringing all this technology into the world of the Association of Ishtar. So yeah, that started out as a joke, but now it's like a serious company that's dominating significant parts of the technological landscape in that world, and entertainment, of course. So yeah, that's how I build.
So this story about the girl, this is what you're working on right now.
Yeah, the current book, I don't know if you can see her on here with this light, but this here is Igraine. She's designated S06, so you can also find her on our website. All our short stories are on associationofishtar.com. And yeah, so she started like kind of like this commentary on Clark Tech. But while writing her short story, I was already like, okay, I want to do a lot more with her, because she basically is a girl who ended up on this world by accident. She's also a pathological liar. So she doesn't want to admit what she had done wrong to end up there. However, because she's now has come in contact where people do technology without all the magical rituals and that kind of stuff, she's not allowed to go back. So yeah, so the association is now stuck with her. Right. And yeah, so basically in the first book, she is on that world stuck for, I think, somewhere around 6 years. And yeah, in the next book takes place a year after the events of the first one. And then she goes to another world that I created. It's actually the home of RadioRetroFuture. Yes, it's an actual location in the multiverse. It's in Arcology, the self-proclaimed capital of the multiverse. And yes, he goes there because it's a very unique place in the multiverse where all this technology and all these ideas basically come together. And she is there to get prepared because, well, she's kind of like a cyborg by some form of definition, I guess. And yes, he needs to be repaired after the events of the first one. So yeah, and it's basically her, you know, it's kind of like a growing up story. But it's also very much an exploration of the city of Arcology, where it takes place, and the people who live there. Because the idea behind the city of Arcology is that it's a multiverse. Sometimes a world goes boom, and a limited number of survivors are brought by an object, a phenomena dubbed, I think it's P11, Phenomena 11. It's brought to Arcology, where they then, well, their world is gone. They don't speak the language of the people who live there because they're all from different worlds and different cultures with different histories. So it's this strange, weird amalgamation of everything you can imagine. And well, oh yeah, it's also surrounded by Lovecraftian horrors. So enjoy.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so yeah, that's the next book. It's also fortunately a lot thinner. I hope to have it like somewhere around 90,000 instead of 134,000. But yeah, it's a lot more fantastical, a lot more typical sci-fi, and it's steampunk only in themes, I guess you could say.
Okay. Right. Okay. How's that question coming, Lee?
Well, I had one question right from the start. I'm going completely off the literary track here. So you had sort of like three areas. at the start. We have the aesthetic of steampunk, we have the literary sense of steampunk, and then we have like the community thing. And you said like there are traditions within steampunk, and that fascinated me. Can you like share any of these? This sounds
well, there are two particular ones. One of them is tea dueling. I'm not big on it myself, but a lot of steampunks love it. And tea dueling is basically well, you have tea. You have two participants and a judge, and every contestant is given a biscuit. It needs to be a particular biscuit approved by the judge. And the idea is that you dip your biscuit in the tea, then you hold it up. Also, the biscuit then soaks up the tea, and the person who can hold it up the longest without having it break wins. So
okay.
So yeah, you have to bite it before it breaks, but after your opponent does so.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, it's very serious. And I actually had a conversation a long time ago with the person who conceived it is teapot racing.
Okay.
And that is basically you have an RC car. You make it your own thing, like usually something tea themed, but it can be anything really. And they've got this obstacle course for the RC cars. Now, all these RC cars are carrying above their weight because of the teapots. So yeah, and then they race around with it. So that's teapot racing. I don't really know the rules. I have not really done it, but the idea was that Lisa Rooney, she's from New Zealand. They have like the steampunk capital. Some New Zealand name, some gibberish name. I forgot what it is. But they've got a steampunk museum there as well and everything. However, she had a friend, she's in a wheelchair, and you know, she wanted to have her engage in activities as well, and that's how she came up with the teapot racing game,
right?
Basically. So that's how that went, and yeah, they do that worldwide. They have competitions and stuff.
I know what our next two videos are.
Yeah,
tea dueling, teapot racing. It's interesting though, isn't it? So there's sort of like an emphasis around tea in these two traditions, and then looking at my very limited knowledge of steampunk, we're looking at the Victorian era. Now in this time in our world,
let me put a stipulation to that: the pop culture version of the Victorian era, and the pop culture version of English. So that's tea. So that's where I believe that comes from. That's my personal theory. Yeah.
Is there like a heavy like British influence within the literary world of steampunk? Because if we look at sort of Victorian England, this was when Great Britain was great. We owned, you know, all of the world, and we're, you know.
No, well, again, you know, again that. It's again that pop culture version of the time, you know, and steampunk being very Anglophile. You know, it goes to, you know, well, what was America before, you know, before the English, you know, there's that current, but also it refers to Wells and Verne and all those authors as well. And again, so that heavy emphasis on the pop culture there, I think, is very relevant. And you know, because when it comes to Dutch authors, yeah, sure, we have some Dutch authors, but you will not see them reflected in steampunk, not in general, unless I do so, or a fellow Dutch author. But yeah, and that's also, you know, why it's, for me, I find it's a shame that so many well, steampunk books are actually either futuristic dystopia or pure fantasy, because you know, it's, you know, we could like bring back some of those authors from you know, the shadows of the past, so to speak. You know, we have I think this is actually quite popular in England as well. Max Havelaar and the history of the Dutch Indies, which was about the coffee plantations and stuff, which was a very influential book at its time, because it kind of like exposed the things that were happening in the current Indonesia. And that has found its way somewhere in Dutch pop culture. A friend of mine actually wrote a book, Max Havelaar and Zombies. So because that's same idea as Pride and Prejudice with zombies. But yeah, you can like do that. And currently, I'm talking with an artist. He's done some work for the coloring book project. Johan Alexander. He's actually doing a dieselpunk comic about the Dutch Indies, with a lot of actual historical uniforming and stuff like that. And I really hope to do more stuff like that. I also wrote because my family is from the Dutch Indies. They fled there from the war. My mother and her family were in a prison camp, Japanese prison camp. So I want to do more with that as well. So I hope to get around to with that to him. And I also include one of the stories, and I want to have more stories set there in the Association of Wishdom as well, where they're investigating strange events going on there. Because there's also one thing I also like to do with the Association of Wishdom in particular is kind of like to discuss like all the conspiracy theories about ancient civilizations. So I'm also playing a lot with that because I find it fascinating, all the strange mysteries that we do not understand and will probably never know because we just simply, it does not exist anymore. And Indonesia also has like some incredibly ancient ruins, which we're baffled by how they got there. So yeah, I love playing with those ideas as well, and those strange archaeological discoveries we have no explanation for.
That's something I love getting into in tabletop stuff.
Yeah,
ancient civilization stuff. But yeah, go on, Lee.
I think we're going basically down the same route here, Matt, because you briefly said, Bonsart, about the at least at very least the archaeology is sort of surrounded by cosmic horrors, and I know Matt loves this as well. Occasionally he'll just drop in an occasional unknowable being for us to attempt to destroy before it destroys us. And these two genres, if you want to, they feel, to me anyway, a complete uncultured Luddite sort of thing. They feel like they dovetail quite nicely together, steampunk and cosmic horror. I don't know, maybe that's because when sort of
well, it's the theme of progress. I mean, what inspired cosmic horror, and I actually made a video on this as well, by the way, Lovecraft and steampunk. One of my better videos probably as well, more of my artistic videos, let's just put it that way. So I highly recommend it. But the whole idea from where cosmic horror comes from is change. The fear of I think Near Lautertab, one of my favorite old ones, was I think inspired by Tesla's inventions, and this strange kind of, because people did not understand electricity at the time. They didn't understand its dangers or how it worked or what it was. And one thing, and I should really make a video on the Industrial Revolution, because you have to understand that when you were born, let's say 1750, when the Industrial Revolution began, you went from a rural society where the majority of people lived on the countryside. By 1800 in England, the majority of the people lived in the cities. And the traditional jobs of people working the land were replaced with people working in the factories. People were having big families because, they used to think that most of those children would not become 5, but they did. Yeah. So, those types of things, we do not, we talk about, people growing old right now, and they don't understand how computers work or how mobile phones work. They can't do their banking anymore because, all those facilities are being removed and everything is becoming digital. Back then, that was even worse, and I mean, even old people can read like the internet newspaper. Like, we are constantly exposed to information. Back then, they were not. So, all of a sudden, a guy on an electric car would drive by. How the fuck did that happen? You know, there were no radios. There was no mass communication. People had to learn it from, if they could read, they could read it in like newspapers, stuff like that. Also, a lot of people could learn to read. So you had like a lot of publication happening as well, like dime novels, like comic book, like the common comic book started in that period with the penny dreadfuls, you know, that type of mass media. You know, and that's also where the aesthetic from steampunk comes from, by the way. Is inspired by. Like there's a story called the Electric Bobs and the Electric Ostrich, which is a guy who built this. Well, now we would call it a steampunk robot, but I also want to do a homage at some point. I have this idea for a robot like that, called by a company called Jupiter Power Unlimited. I thought it was a clever name. So yeah, they have these ostriches running around the prairie to defend their wireless energy towers, and yeah, and there are all these like weird inventions. It's all from that era of early printing, and I mean, and what's amazing about ancient sci-fi, by the way, there is this short story called what's it called again? The Machine Stops. And I actually did an audio book on that on my other channel. They predicted everything, man. They knew where our society was going. They predicted social media. They predicted the internet. And they predicted the effects it would have on humanity.
Ooh.
They knew that by 1900, they knew exactly what was going to happen. Read that story and see how that's not reflective of our society. But yeah, many of the dystopian ideas were actually conceived in that period. Like H.G. Wells and his friends, they were. Yeah. They, I mean, if their ideas were, then Hitler would have looked tame, you know. They were great fans of Hitler, by the way. Of course, you know, that was in the 1920s, 1930s. And then they became upset that they were fighting their biggest hero, which was Stalin. So kind of like and that's the people that the literary scene was exposed to. So they knew exactly what they wanted and how it would end. So yeah, I think
Huxley, now the bedfellows people are making. Particularly
I think actually Huxley's book Brave New World was a commentary on Wells's ideas of the time. I could be lying about that one, but or maybe it was Schur. Yeah, I think his name was Schur. He was yeah. There's this story. Have you watched Red Dwarf?
Yes.
There is this character at one episode, the judge. Or the who's going through time, removing people he finds unworthy.
The Inquisitor, yeah.
The Inquisitor, yeah. Well, he was probably inspired by Schur, because that was his proposal to do. That's the kind of world he wanted, where people had to justify their existence to, well, a world government essentially, or get removed from the gene pool. So
there's a bit of Heinlein as well with service guaranteed citizenship. That kind of thing.
Well, Heinlein was hated. He was the anti-Wells and Schur. I mean, the thing with Heinrich, they say he's a fascist, but no, he's the opposite.
Yeah, I've heard this. The conversations.
Yeah, but I mean, well, the thing is, well, here's the thing about fascism. People don't know what fascism is. They have no fucking clue. First of all, you got to realize that Mussolini, he was a communist before he started identifying as a fascist.
Like the thing I feel with fascism is not on. It doesn't have a place on the the political spectrum that way. Definitely this way, up here, but it doesn't have a place really like on the left-right.
Well, it does if you realize that the reason why the fascists came to be, and now I'm just talking about the guys in Italy, that they were split off from the communists, and what the fascists and also an extent the National Socialists, and the name kind of already betrays it, that there was this fight between the communists and that kind of like had Zenith in the First World War, where there were the communists who were anti-war because it was bad for worker solidarity. These were the internationals, and they believed in this international movement of and the worldwide revolution of the working class. And then there were people like Mussolini who said, well, look at reality, this is bullshit, right? They said, well, if workers have to choose between their own families and the international worker community, they're going to choose their own families. And that fight kind of like led to a split between various communist movements, including the fascists. Well, they became the fascists, but they're still anti-capitalist. They're still pro-state. They're still pro-democracy, or at least in their manifestos they are. They still want all the same things that the communists want. But it is the, well, they're no more nationalists. But they still believe like in autarky and all that stuff. And when you read Mussolini's work, he also talks about a lot of the same things as Marx does. And he has exactly the same ideas, except that where Marx believed that capitalism would lead into communism, Mussolini said, well, he agreed in part that capitalism would end up and become extremely corrupted. The National Socialists, at their own spin, said, well, they're the Jews. This is very well reflected in Ford's dissertation on Jewishness, who explains this very well, and also well liked by Hitler for that reason, I assume. Well, what Mussolini said, and I think, and the scary thing is a lot of modern lefties would agree with this, that capitalists became so corrupt. You know, there is no difference between corporate interest and the state. I don't think many people would find that controversial. However, Mussolini's reason was, well, if this is the case, the state might as well take over the corporations and have that be the end of it. And, you know, and so nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, nothing, I forgot the third one. But that's basically where fascism is the end of private property. And also they learned their lesson from Russia. Don't forget that you know, this is one trick that you know, the apologists like to use. Like, well, Hitler you know, kept the capitalist kept capitalism. Yeah, of course, because you know, both Mussolini and Hitler saw what would happen if you try to destroy those. And also remember that a lot of communists fled from Russia because of the Stalin's purges, and they joined like the socialists in Italy and Germany and Spain and all those places. So they knew, you know, it would be stupid to try and destroy something that worked. So that also played a major role in that. And this is also why there's this big slap fight about like, was Hitler a socialist or not? You know, it's Catholics and Protestants. You know, who are the true Christians? You know, if you would have asked a German in the 1930s, 1920s, who are the true socialists? They will say, well, nationalist socialists are, of course, the true socialists. If you would go to Russia, who are the true socialists? Well, obviously, Comrade Stalin is, you know, proselytizing the true socialism. And that's where that's yeah, non-issue actually comes from, because it really doesn't matter. We know what happens when you go too far. So it's
so funny. We our main thing on this podcast is going off on tangents, and it just happens no matter what. Whereas this thing, we've gone from steampunk all the way out to, but it's where these things like the literary ideas kind of originate, right?
Yeah, but I mean, this is important because especially when it comes to high concept, it's an exploration of ideas and human behavior. And, you know, and well, if we look at Christianity, you know, one of the most telling things a professor once said in class to me was, okay, about the Aryans and the first Christians. He said, you know, what group of people did the first Christians go after when they got in power? And he said, well, I think it are other Christians. And, you know, and when you are familiar, if you are familiar with moral foundations theory, you know, one of the most important pillars in that theory is loyalty betrayal.
So who were the first people against the wall after the revolution?
Yeah. I mean, what
revolutionaries.
was the first thing that the communists went after in Russia? Well, it were the worker communes. It were the Soviets, where the Soviet Union gets its name from. That's the first ones they started taking out because their ideas were not pure enough. And that's also has to do a lot with loyalty foundation. So if you have like a group that splits off of your movement, those are traitors. When you read Dante's Inferno, what is the lowest level of hell? Who go there? Do you know?
No.
They're traitors.
Right.
Traitors.
They're heretics.
Mm-hmm.
When you read Christian theology from the Middle Ages, like they don't hate the heathens. The heathens are deceived by demons. You cannot blame a person who's deceived. It's easy to convince people of a lie. It's hard to convince them that they are wrong. That's how they looked at heathens. But heretics, no, the heretics are the people who should know better. They are traitors. So for them, they get banished to the lowest levels of hell. They get the worst torment. And you see this all throughout history. It's the reason why people are destroying each other on Twitter. We talk about cancel culture. Now we often view it like, oh, it's left versus right. No, they go after their own the hardest. That's also what gatekeeping is about. It's to protect the community. So that went into a dark place.
Yeah, I don't have any question to tangent away from that back to steampunk. Lee, do you have one?
No, I'm reveling in that conversation. I think it's.
No, I think you're absolutely right about the sort of. I don't even have the words now. It's like where the kind of the machinations of human behavior and the ideas that kind of rise up amongst groups and how those ideas evolve and devolve and how they kind of eat each other is.
It's the joke. They're eating each other. And please let them continue. I mean, when you look at a lot of movements, they were destroyed from within. They were destroyed by infighting, and for that reason. Especially when it comes to authoritarianism, it can take very dark behaviors, and it will all feel justified in the end. And it's also a kind of a theme in the Wrench in the Machine. It's actually where the title of the book comes from. So yes, I can find a way to bring it back to steampunk.
I just did as well.
Yeah, okay, but the Wrench in the Machine, it kind of implies like there is this system in place, and someone is about to throw a wrench in it, kind of like exposing all the flaws. And it's about how people are trying to cover up certain things because it will make them look bad. And one thing, especially what the establishment likes to do, is to pretend nothing is wrong because they don't want to take responsibility for it, especially in democracy, but especially in authoritarian regimes. But if you there's an important difference between democracy and authoritarianism. That authoritarians, they always try to pretend everything is fine and everything is great, whereas in democracies we are constantly telling in how much danger we are and how the ruling party is responsible. So democracy is very fear-based, whereas authoritarianism is, well, keep people ignorant of what's actually happening. So because we need to look powerful, otherwise the people will turn against us. And that's kind of like what's happening in the Wrench in the Machine, where authorities are trying. No, everything is fine. We're dealing with the problem. Our harvests are failing. We're gonna kill all the birds. What they did in China. That kind of thing, and that's and then the Wrench of a Machine that's surfaces all of a sudden.
So with these things in mind, then, how have you gone about building a steampunk world for the stories to kind of inhabit?
No, well, like I said, I started with the short stories. Like I don't write like entire dissertations on what the world should look like in theory. It's also something that I advise against all my people who I coach from time to time. And you know, people ask me like, how did you write over 30 plus short stories for your series in so little time? So, well, I don't like spend years writing documents on what I want the world to be like. No, the world looks like based on the short stories that I write. And I start with a concept, like for example, as I did with the call girl, and then I just started writing and how would an assassin like that operate? Why does he behave the way they did? And that kind of led, like for example, how the associate got numbers instead of code names, how they're wearing radios even though they're not supposed to have radios. So I needed to invent an excuse for, okay, why are there radios in this world then, which led to the creation of utter crap. And you know, what do they do? So I had to explore, think of ideas what they would do, and combine it with concepts and try to interlock all of that. And that's kind of like how it grows. And you know, I have this entire folder with concepts that I want to work out at some point, if the idea still appeals to me back then. And yeah, so it's all stories. Every bit of lore can be traced back to a story, so it's not headcanon, but things that you can actually justify by, well, this is what happens in that story. I do play a little bit often loose with the canon, so
that was going to be my how do you keep up with the canon?
Well, I mean, it's because I'm currently the only person working on it. It's easy to you know, keep kind of like a straight line. But I think it's also important that if you had like one idea, make sure, but it gets like usurped by a superior idea, that I allow that room to be there. Like one thing about my short stories is like they're documents who actually exist in the world. So they could actually be stuff you can find in your RPG, as it were, and base an RPG on. However, I also then think, well, it doesn't need to be objective. It's subjective material in its own world. You know, people like maybe not mention things, or you know, revel in their own parts, and you know, exaggerate what they've done, for example, or you know, they just don't know stuff. That also happens. We are ignorant of what we don't know about. And I'm also very careful when I write my short stories that I give the reader all the answers they need, but vague enough that I am still at liberty to go anywhere I want with them. So I really try to focus, like, okay, what are the answers that I want to, what are the questions I want to answer? Like what needs to be the punchline of a short story, especially in short stories, very important that there is a punchline. And what is like, well, the stuff that's not as important, that's, you know, so I'm really focusing on, like, I'm really writing it like a tour guide, you know. I'm only showing the part that I want them to see and nothing else, because, you know, it might be interesting to show that or explore that in another moment. And then because they're files, I'm also at liberty to redact stuff. Like, yeah, there's stuff happened here. There's important information here that answers like the question, but it's not important for this story. That's for another story. And so the reader can like also, I think this is also very important. People can like let their own imagination take control at a moment. Like, oh, they're talking about something secret here, something that they don't want us to know. What is it? You know? But I also warn, I have a blog on this, you know, that it isn't cheating, because there's also a lot of, it's also used for a lot of cheating, where it's like, oh, well, the people are going to blank, and then this happens at blank, and blank. Yeah, that's just, you know, I don't want to be bothered to think of names or be called out that, you know, stuff like that. So that's also a thing. And I'm against that. It needs to be something that the reader understands. They know something is important is being discussed there, something that upsets a character, but they can imagine like what could it be by reading more stories. Or not at all, because I did not come up with anything clever. I forgot about the story. It can also happen. Or then all of a sudden I write a book and that's like, oh, I can like insert that file in that book. And but yeah, that's for the future. I'm only working on my second book now, so let's not go ahead of ourselves. But
right, yeah, no spoilers. Yeah.
Well, I have no idea what I'm gonna read. I'm not even sure what I'm gonna write afterward. I was thinking of expanding on that on the Coven Girls, which is the second story in this comic. Well, it's actually just a short story, but it has some incredible art by one of the original creators of the BattleTech art, Eldon Crowder. So I'm really proud of that. It was a gift by him because he wasn't happy with it. So yeah, it's a great design. So I hope I'm really anxious to get working on that after this book is done.
All right, nice. Okay, Lee, any more?
I don't think there's anything from me. I just want to start reading these short stories now.
All right.
Well, like I said, you can write your own. I mean, now we have a challenge for 2,000 words, which is the esteemed members of the chair challenge. The challenge is write a 2,000-word story starting with esteemed members of the chair. And it can be anything after that. Informal challenge. The winners gets a free ebook, and
Minds are going to be all over that, I reckon. Loads of writers on Minds.
All right.
Yeah.
I should promote. I should boost that post at some point. But please share it. It's on my Minds timeline right now. And and if there are stories you enjoy, please also share them on Minds and places like that. Feedback has been very positive overall. So people really seem to enjoy the stories because it's not. I mean, for people who enjoy SCP, they will most definitely enjoy Association of Ishtar. There are. There is some inspiration of SCP there. However, I do want to give it my own format. I want it to be more narrative focused. Because although I really appreciate what the SCP Foundation has done. I don't like the descriptions. The sections, they are often far too bland. I try to really teach people show, don't tell, focus on actions, make sure everything is an action. So the characters are always doing something in a sentence, and instead oh, there is a wet vase. Okay, well, that's interesting prose right there. So I write blogs on that, on how to write sentences like that, and also a blog on how to write a sentence, because that's also a challenge for a lot of aspiring writers. I can tell you that. For the people who want coaching with writing, we have on our Discord a thread that is called Submit Your Lines, where you get to submit up to 5-7 lines. Because this is a tip for people who proofread other people's work and they don't know the writer yet. Ask them to submit 5 lines. And the reason for that is experience tells me that if you write a short story from a wannabe writer, the mistakes they make in the first 5 lines, they mail throughout the story. They repeat. They don't stop. No, it's consistent. If you don't know a writer and you want to proofread them, just start with their 5 lines and you'll be able to give them far more valuable feedback than you would be able to give them if you are forced to go through the entire story and spot every mistake they made in there. So that's my pro tip. And the Submit Your Line thread is based on that entire concept. And it's a lot more constructive and a lot more easier to analyze. So
all right, very good. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to pause there.
I think so.
That's a good place to pause. All right, so thank you for coming on. This has been a really, really interesting conversation.
Yeah, I hope,
we've hit some
I hope
interesting
not too
places.
spicy, not too controversial on the political front. But
Oh, hey man, just say what you like.
We started our careers like that, so
Yeah, man. Yeah, fantastic. Well, all the links to
every single link.
Yeah, all the links are going to be in the description to Ishtar and to the competition and to all of these things. Yeah, it's all going to be in the description. Check out these books. Check out is the comic available?
Yeah. It's all available. You can, if you're interested in an ebook, you can also order it straight from me. So I'll add some content you won't get on Amazon and other places. The physical copy, if people want signed copies, they can send me an email as well. And I always add some other stuff, especially for people who are into cosplaying. Speaking of which, I have a pattern of an associate mask on the website that's freely downloadable as well. Yeah, and like the idea behind the Association of Ishtar, like is that it becomes both a community for writers starting out, people want to experiment with ideas and worlds, or maybe present their ideas from the perspective of the Association of Ishtar, because it's a multiverse. So, you know, you can add any world you want, and yeah, we'll see where this adventure goes in the end. So,
let the dueling begin.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so our writing challenge is the first one. I hope to do more informal ones, you know, and just have this huge collection of stories by the end, and who knows what we'll be able to do. A game is one of my end goals, to have a board game at some point. So if people want to help develop that, or brainstorm, or say what kind of game they want, yeah, who knows, man, we can do it all.
This is another thing that we're doing. We're developing games as well.
Oh, okay.
Alchemy.
Oh, well, you're on our Discord, so yeah. Just let's stay in touch then. And
absolutely,
yeah,
definitely, yes. So where can people find you on?
Well, I'm pretty much on every platform, as most of them I am, as RadioRetroFuture. Like, don't expect any political content of me. I'm already wasting too much time on that in my private life. So, yeah. But you know, if you want to talk about writing, or you know, if people want a writing workshop with me, let me know. We have a Discord. A link is under all my videos on RadioRetroFuture on YouTube. Of course, we have a website, associationofishtar.com, and we have a second channel where I'm barely posting anything because I'm a one-man team. And yeah, but for those who don't have time to read short stories or don't like reading, we also have audiobook versions, including the first 4 chapters of The Wrench in the Machine. That also includes the Call Girl, because that's one of the stories that's in there. But yeah, if you want to support me, you can do so on Patreon or Subscribestar, or just buy my shit. And soon we also have new merchandise, which is minis, including 2 miniatures of an associate and the Call Girl, and bookend versions of them. So if you want something to paint, yeah, they'll soon be available. I hope.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, brilliant. Well, sub to Radio Retro Future, like, subscribe, share the Alchemy Lab this video. This is fantastic. You can find me at Matt Waterhouse Author on Minds. I'm
somewhere on Minds. I don't know who I am on Minds.
All right. And we'll catch you in the next one. Ta-ra.
Right. Thank you, gentlemen.